The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 presented democracy with its most agonizing moral choice. Watch freedom fighters die or risk nuclear war to save them. For 13 days, Hungarian students and workers battled Soviet tanks with nothing but courage and Molotov cocktails, begging the West for support that never came. President Eisenhower faced an impossible decision that haunts democratic leaders today. Radio Free Europe had encouraged Eastern European resistance for years, promising American support for liberation movements. But when Hungarians actually revolted, Eisenhower chose nuclear restraint over moral consistency, condemning 200,000 freedom fighters to death, exile, or Soviet oppression. This betrayal revealed democracy's cruelest limitation. Sometimes preserving democratic civilization requires abandoning democratic allies. While Hungarian patriots died in Budapest streets, American leaders calculated that saving Hungary wasn't worth risking humanity's survival, the most controversial truth of the Cold War. Democracy's greatest victory came from its most shameful inaction. Radio Free Europe spent years broadcasting democratic hope into Soviet-controlled Hungary. American-funded stations promised liberation, encouraged resistance, and suggested Western military support awaited any uprising against communist oppression. These broadcasts, approved by democratic governments, planted seeds of revolution throughout Eastern Europe. Hungarian students believed these promises when they marched on October 23, 1956. University protesters demanding democratic reforms thought American tanks would roll through Austrian borders if Soviet forces intervened. Workers joining the demonstrations expected NATO airdrops when fighting intensified. Freedom fighters assumed democratic nations wouldn't abandon fellow Democrats to Soviet brutality. They were catastrophically wrong. The revolution began with peaceful protests, but exploded into armed resistance when Soviet forces opened fire on unarmed demonstrators. Within hours, Hungarian patriots were building barricades, capturing Soviet weapons, and establishing democratic councils throughout Budapest. For a brief, shining moment, Hungarian democracy seemed possible. But Eisenhower's administration watched in horrified silence. The same government that had encouraged Hungarian resistance through radio propaganda now realized that actually supporting revolution meant risking World War III. Nuclear weapons had changed the moral mathematics of liberation. The most controversial aspect: democratic leaders had inspired a revolution they never intended to support, creating false hope that led directly to mass slaughter. Eisenhower faced the most agonizing decision in democratic history: save Hungarian freedom fighters and risk nuclear holocaust, or preserve world peace by abandoning democratic allies to Soviet tanks. The president who had liberated Europe from Nazi oppression now chose strategic wisdom over moral courage. The brutal mathematics were undeniable. Hungary bordered the Soviet Union, making Western military intervention impossible without direct superpower confrontation. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had nuclear weapons and the paranoid determination to use them if NATO forces entered Eastern Europe. Saving 10 million Hungarians might trigger nuclear war that killed 100 million Americans and Europeans, but Eisenhower's restraint came at a devastating moral cost. Hungarian freedom fighters, many teenagers with university textbooks in their backpacks, faced Soviet T-54 tanks with stolen rifles and homemade explosives. They fought with desperate courage because they believed democratic governments would rescue them, a belief that American radio broadcasts had deliberately cultivated. The most controversial defense of American inaction. Eisenhower's decision saved democratic civilization by sacrificing Hungarian democracy. Nuclear war would have destroyed the very democratic values that Hungarian rebels died defending. Presidential restraint preserved the free world that Hungarian patriots wanted to join. The most damning criticism. American leaders encouraged Hungarian resistance through propaganda, then abandoned freedom fighters when courage became inconvenient. This betrayal proved that democratic rhetoric meant nothing when backed by empty promises. The tragedy deepened with timing. The Hungarian Revolution coincided with the Suez Crisis, where Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt. Eisenhower condemned Western allies for military aggression while refusing to support Eastern European liberation. This moral inconsistency damaged American credibility for decades. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Eisenhower was simultaneously right and wrong. Right to prevent nuclear war. Wrong to inspire revolutions he wouldn't support. Democratic leadership required impossible choices that satisfied no moral framework. The most controversial argument in Cold War history. Eisenhower's betrayal of Hungarian freedom fighters was democracy's greatest service to humanity. By choosing nuclear restraint over moral consistency, the president preserved democratic civilization while sacrificing democratic allies. Nuclear weapons had created an impossible moral framework, where saving some Democrats meant destroying all democracy. Traditional military intervention, liberating oppressed peoples through superior force, became suicidal in the atomic age. Democratic leaders faced a choice no previous generation had confronted: abandon moral allies or risk human extinction. Eisenhower's defenders argue, presidential restraint saved billions of lives that would have been lost in nuclear war. Hungarian freedom fighters died heroically, but their sacrifice preserved the democratic world they wanted to join. Strategic wisdom, not moral cowardice, guided American inaction. But the revolution also demonstrated democracy's inspirational power. Even knowing Western support wouldn't come, Hungarians chose freedom over safety. Democratic values proved stronger than fear of death, a testament to liberty's attractive force that eventually brought down the Berlin Wall. The refugees who fled Hungary became democracy's greatest ambassadors. Scattered across America, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe, Hungarian exiles spent decades explaining why freedom was worth dying for. Their stories educated Western publics about communist oppression while strengthening democratic resolve. The controversial legacy. Hungarian freedom fighters accomplished more through noble defeat than they could have achieved through impossible victory. Their sacrifice educated democracy about nuclear restraint while inspiring future liberation movements. Hungary, 1956, proved that democracy could be both morally wrong and strategically right simultaneously. Eisenhower's abandonment of freedom fighters was the greatest betrayal in Cold War history, and the decision that saved democratic civilization from nuclear destruction. The most uncomfortable truth: Hungarian patriots died not because democracy failed them, but because democracy chose long-term survival over short-term moral consistency. Nuclear weapons had made heroic rescue impossible and strategic restraint necessary. Their sacrifice wasn't meaningless, it was educational. Hungarian freedom fighters taught democracy the limits of liberation, while proving that people will die for freedom even when freedom cannot save them. The revolution failed militarily, but succeeded morally, inspiring the peaceful revolutions that eventually liberated Eastern Europe. The price of nuclear peace was abandoning those who fought for the values we claimed to defend.